All right, I think we're good now. So when we take a look, today we're here for Managing Microsoft Teams. My name is Pat Peterson. I'm joined by a colleague of mine, Chris Watson. We'll go through introductions here in just a moment. Again, just to echo some of the items that were mentioned of, keep in mind, feel free to share this on social media, help get the word out. It is nice to have an online event that anyone around the world could join and learn from each other. Also, just to echo a lot of the sponsors, if it wasn't for the sponsors, we wouldn't have an event like this. So always take some time to review the sponsors and say thank you if you come across someone that works there or is involved. With that, we'll run through some quick introductions on our side. So my name's Pat Peterson. Both Chris and I work for an organization called RSM. RSM is a consulting, tax, and audit organization. Both Chris and I are on the consulting or the technology consulting side. We live and breathe Microsoft Teams day in and day out. When you take a look at what that means, that can be anywhere from administration to adoption enablement, as well as voice deployments, meeting deployments, conference rooms, the whole from start to finish, including some custom apps and migration tools. Chris, I'll let you do a quick introduction of yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Chris. I've been working with Teams for, I actually had to look it up yesterday, almost 5 years now, since 2018, really dove into it. I've been doing deployments with Pat for a few months now. I actually just moved over from RSM. I used to specialize in healthcare and education, and then aerospace and defense was my other specialty. So if you guys do have questions around education or healthcare, please do feel free to ask, and I'm more than happy to dive into those topics for a little bit as well.
Gotcha. Thank you, Chris. And you'll hear from him a little bit later on in the presentation. So let's talk through what we're going to review here today. So we're going to talk through some basic governance items inside of managing Microsoft Teams. That will include things such as naming policies, blocked words, expiration, the template portion that's out there. We'll also take a look at some policies. And when we look at policies, that's not the exciting stuff with it. Obviously, when you look at that, there is an efficient way to manage those and just some common understanding. If you haven't reviewed the policies inside of your organization, I'd encourage you to do that. There is a lot of neat things that you can change and adjust from a user perspective to ensure that they have, the correct access and the experience is accurate there. If you just let users use it with how it's enabled or turned on, it's probably why some of you are here, is because you understand the importance of limiting that. Chris is going to go in depth through the request to team app process that's there. That is, a partial solution that Microsoft has developed, but then also utilizing some Azure features on the back end for you. So if you are someone that's interested in how can I manage how a Microsoft team gets created and manage that entire life cycle, Chris is going to dive deep into that in about a half an hour into the request to team. Then we'll just take a look at the admin center a little bit, focusing on the productivity score and some of the other features and functions that are available. And then we'll finish up with voice if time allows. With that, we'll make sure there's enough time for Tim to find a specific winner here today. So again, if you do have questions or comments, please feel free to put those in the chat window, or we will pause periodically if you have questions and want to unmute yourself. In fact, I'm surprised not one person has posted something in there yet, just to get their name, make their name important on there. I suppose everyone wants that Surface Go 3, so. All right, so when we take a look at Microsoft Teams, one of the items to mention here is that Microsoft Teams, of course, is an entire ecosystem. And so when you think about managing Microsoft Teams, it's not just one feature or one function. When I look at deploying Microsoft Teams in an organization, there's a lot of moving parts, right? What is that guest experience? What is that external experience? What is that internal experience? And how siloed do we want to get on the internal side? For instance, do we want to let all of our users record a meeting, or just some of the users to record a meeting? Or do we want to let all users, participate in all the fun stuff that comes with chat, or do we want to limit that? And then, of course, what do we want guests and external users to have access to? And the guest and external collaboration, of course, is a setting that can be controlled in a couple different areas, whether that's inside of Teams for the Teams portion, the SharePoint or file sharing portion, or of course across the entire tenant inside of Azure. And we'll explore that here a little bit later today as well. So with that, when we take a look, this is an older slide that I borrowed from a Microsoft deck. But with that, I think it's important to note that Teams uses a lot of things. And so the reason why that's important is when you look at managing Microsoft Teams, you do have to have your hands in a lot of different areas. And so as simple as a file stored inside of a team is also stored inside a SharePoint, and so keeping that in mind in the policies and the sharing settings there as well. Not to mention the third-party applications that if somebody is deploying or utilizing Smartsheets or Rike, a Trello, or ServiceNow, for instance, of course there's additional licensing and options there as well that would be needed. This is one that I always like to share specifically for us to be able to see and look at this for you to understand how does Microsoft Teams fit into the ecosystem of products. One of the common complaints that Chris, myself, and others on our team here on a regular basis is they say Teams, okay, that's another application to check for communication, or that's another application where I have to find a file, or that's another application that starts up and is in my face and is sending me notifications throughout the day. And so this really becomes, an example for you. And again, this is focused in on files, but I would encourage you to think about it not in collaboration, but focus on the communication side of it as well. When we think about it, say, all right, how should someone get a hold of somebody else inside of the organization? When does Teams trump email versus text messaging versus the old school phone call? Or when should we utilize a channel conversation to post or possibly an announcement across multiple teams? When should we use that over sending an email? Or certainly you could probably throw Yammer into that mix from a communication perspective if you're an organization that utilizes that as well. But keep in mind when we think about it, one of the items that makes Teams really easy to use and adopt is its integration with the rest of the Microsoft application. Yesterday, Chris and I did a demo for a client that is heavily utilizing Teams for chat and meetings today, and they're evaluating a phone system replacement. They only have about 35 users, so it's not an in-depth or complex phone system at all. But they're really between two products. They're between Zoom and Microsoft Teams. And when they looked at it and they're sitting and reviewing it, one of the big components that they're using to rate those is the integration with other applications users are used to using today. And so I think from that side of it, Teams certainly helps out because they already are using it and already adopting the technology. With that then, though, when you take a look at the collaboration strategy and file storage here, I really want you just to kind of focus down on the bottom portion of the screen that'll circle in red. Where is that more formal and less formal? So take that out, throw the word collaboration out and put in the word communication. And maybe you change those buckets or those silos across the top of the screen as well. So just something to make mention to help. A simple diagram like this for your users goes a long way. Will email die? No, email will not go away. In my life, how has Teams changed my email behavior? If someone needs to get a hold of me internally, we typically will utilize Teams, whether it's a channel posting or a instant message. And generally, that's just quicker, more effective, and much easier. And then since I work with a lot of outside or external clients, then generally that is where email comes into play. So I've actually seen my email usage decrease quite a bit. Has anyone developed a solution similar to this or a diagram similar to this when they look at communicating Microsoft Teams and what all the different technologies are that are out there? If so, feel free to just put that in the chat window if you have a specific story that has helped with that as well. All right. Just as a review for you, file structure with inside of Teams and chats for you. Okay, so Jason said Yammer as well. That's always a tricky one where Yammer actually fits into the mix for a lot of organizations, whether it's big or small. File structure, this is one that helps when we think about how do we manage a specific files with inside of Teams. So when we think about managing Teams files, if they're inside of a channel, we obviously have to tie into SharePoint. When we look at managing a team file that maybe is shared in chat, we have to look at OneDrive. And so that's where it's important for you is to understand that managing Microsoft Teams is not just one method or just one item. It does take some knowledge across multiple workloads, specifically on the teamwork side of the world. And then the last item before we dive deeper into is, what is that modern worker out there for? And when you think about what a modern worker is someone that's mobile, moving, they want to work together, they live in social networks, so they're used to those ad hoc, quick messages from users back and forth. They work on multiple devices. They expect that experience to be the same. And then they also can go ahead and work with outside or external parties to accomplish those goals. And so that's where that guest access comes in. So let's dive into some basic governance items here for us. So when we take a look at some basic governance items along the way, it's important to note that Microsoft Teams, of course, sits on top of Microsoft 365 groups. And so a lot of the settings that we're talking through in this section are at the group level for it. And so we'll take some time to review those here as well. But each team's part of a group, and then all group settings do impact the team for you. With that, some special notes or caveats. Of course, you do need to utilize Azure AD Premium licensing for some of these features or functions. Always check your licensing. One of the items that's out there is, of course, some of you probably have seen it. If you have one license available, then it lights up a lot of different features and functions within inside of your organization or your tenant. Again, you'll want to make sure you check your licensing. And if anyone ever comes across a Microsoft licensing expert, a real human we can talk to, let us know. I think everyone on this call would enjoy to talk to them about how they come up with some of the licensing piece. If you haven't looked at the Microsoft 365 licensing maps by Aaron, feel free to do a search online. It's a really good resource for licensing as well. All right, so one of the items that comes across a lot of times is what is the difference between the settings and policies? And when you look at that, you can't group them together. They are a little bit different in terms of how you would explain them or how you would take a look at that. So when you think about settings here, settings are a collection of the configuration elements. So if we think about audio conferencing or bridges, those are settings, turning something on or turning something off. Policies are also a collection, but they're grouped by and they're per user or per tenant area. And so they're a little bit different for you to think about and to look at. And so let's take a quick look at those here for us. So you have the ability to see, what we're referring to here. And I had to restart right before I jumped into this meeting. So let me go ahead and just jump into the admin center here. So when we're in here, of course, if I jump into the meetings portion here real quickly, we have a few items. So we have some settings from there, bridge settings for us. And so this is where, we can easily turn on whether or not we have entry and exit beeps, as well as some of the information in terms of names or phone numbers. This is the setting portion. Generally, it's, at that level. If we jump into the policies portion of it, as a lot of you are aware of, the policies are assigned to specific users or across the entire organization, but they allow a little bit more, features or functions or assignment portion that's out there. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're looking at the difference between the two. All right, naming policies within inside of Teams. When you think about the idea here, if you let anyone create a team, you're going to end up with 3 or 4 HR teams by the end of the day, because everyone's going to want to create their own. And then when someone's looking for one or trying to find it, they don't necessarily understand what's out there. So there are some advantages to giving some naming conventions or policies within inside of a team or a group. And Chris is going to review that as well within inside of the Request a Teams app available. When you think about this, this is the idea of actually controlling what users see. So whether there's an acronym for your department, or whether there's a specific, country to keep track of things, or, who the functional owner of a team is. Those are all different things that you can utilize to help with the naming policies of a Microsoft team. With that, that does apply directly to a group perspective. So in this case of it, you can see maybe you put the word team in front of it. You then require the departments, the team name, and then the office location. So an example would be Team Marketing Project Oakdale, US as an example. With that, internally within my organization, we do have a naming convention. Of course, a user has the ability to change the display name of a team, but really that internal name, the email address assigned to the group is consistent and is structured by looking at that. And so with that, if anyone has a naming convention set up already that doesn't follow something like that, if you want to share that, then each other can learn how other organizations use that as well. But again, a naming convention is really important so you don't end up with duplicate or multiple areas, especially when you start looking at where the SharePoint site and what the name of that is compared to the other assets that come into play. We'll take a look at this a little bit deeper here in just a moment, but with that, we have the ability to look at prefixes and suffixes. We can also then enter the group name from a user perspective. It's important to note that the length is limited to 53 characters, but those are settings within inside of the Azure portal for the group naming side of the world, which we'll take a look at here in just a few. One item to make mention is that naming policies don't have or do not apply to everyone. And so this is one where I know I've gotten bit by it before. This is the old method. For those of you that grew up in the SharePoint side of the house, if you recall, what was that? I haven't touched SharePoint on-prem in a while, but if you were logged in with the system admin account, workflows wouldn't automatically trigger with your account. If I recall, I think that was what the issue was. The same thing here though applies. If you're logged in as a global admin or support side of the world, then you certainly don't have, doesn't apply to you as well. And so I think that that's an important component to be aware of. Also looking at what type of role you have, whether it's tier 1 support or tier 2, depending upon how users access it. There was a question that came in from Jason. Is there a way to label a team instead of using a naming policy? For example, instead of adding sales as a prefix, is there a way to keep the name open but then have a label applied as a sales team from a sensitivity label? Chris, with that, is that the request a Teams app? Is that how you'd recommend?
I actually wouldn't use a sensitivity label. At my previous firm, we actually, if we needed to add some metadata just to kind of keep track of it, we would add it to the SharePoint property bag. Just because that's like a nice place to just store variables sometimes. So you could actually put in like sales or your different departments. And if you're using something like the Teams request app, you could go through and use PowerShell as part of this whole creation flow to add different metadata. And the property bag is a really great place because then you could start writing reports that generate off of that. But a sensitivity label I would not use. Sensitivity, that's going to get in the way if you do decide that you want to roll out some of the data leakage prevention features of Microsoft. Having that sensitivity label with sales is not really going to be useful for you.
That's a great question early in the morning, right, Chris?
Oh, it's great. You're really getting my gears going.
Yeah. There's some methods there, and I think when you take a look from a naming side of the world, from a prefix, you can control that, like Chris said, with the request a team, whether it's the PowerShell side of the world that's generating it, or even if you went and just utilized a form and had a Microsoft Flow generate and create that team. You're limited a little bit in some of your features there, and I believe all the connections for creating a team and adding owners to the team is still in preview technically. But you could control some of that naming convention, but the SharePoint properties is a good way to look at it. All right. We'll jump into the configuration here for us just so you can see where that's at with inside of the Azure portal. So with that here, as we're taking a look from a Azure portal side of it, I'll jump into the group portion here. And when we take a look from it, if I jump into the groups, just to be full transparency where I'm at. I'm in a list of all the groups that are there. On the left-hand side, there's some, examples available for me, whether it's expiration or naming policy area for us. We'll cover expiration in the slide deck here in just a moment, but if I look at the naming policy portion of it, this is where I can choose to whether or not I want to utilize blocked words that are in there. Certainly when you take a look at blocked words, that's probably an important piece if you have some keywords you want to make sure are blocked or take a look at for it. Then the group naming policy, in this case of it, I have the ability here. So I can add in a specific attribute or a string to that group name if I choose. Now, again, keep in mind when you throw in a provisioning agent behind the scenes, like what Chris is going to talk about here soon, some of these policies don't have to apply at that point, and because of course you can handle it with the provisioning agent. With that then, when we take a look at the expiration portion here, the expiration is in terms of how long are those groups left after they're no longer active. And so in this case here, one of the items to make mention is you could create a blanket group lifetime, that if something's not active from a 365-day perspective, or if it is an active one, then it can email the specific groups, and then of course come in from an expiration. That is one that we see for a lot of organizations that quickly adopted Teams at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. They just simply let a lot of their users go and create all of their create teams. Of those, some of them are used, some of them are not. And so either archiving them from a Microsoft Teams method so that you can no longer add more content to them, or taking a look at an expiration is certainly something you'd want to review and take a look at.
Can I interject
Yep.
for a minute?
Absolutely.
So one thing that I do want to mention about expiration versus archiving is if you do archive a team, you still have to worry about expiration. So the group expiration policy will always trump archival. So you can go ahead and archive teams, which is a really great option if you still want the team to be part of like your historical records and refer back to it, but you do have to keep that team active or exclude it from the expiration policy. It will prompt the owner of that archived team to renew their team if it's not being used. Again, the 30 days out, the 15 days out, and 1 day before deletion. And don't forget, guys, if they do miss it, you have that extra little bit of time when it's in the admin recycle bin that you can go back into Azure AD and restore that group. But just one thing to call out there is that expiration policies do trump archival.
Yep. And Chris, there's another option in there. Brian asked, I don't suppose you could have a different expiration based on the prefix. That would be nice.
What you could probably do, and I'd have to look at the PowerShell. If we have PowerShell around that, you could look and query all of your groups, and then based on a prefix, kind of put them in different expiration policies or exclude them.
I suppose you could also look at running. Well, there should be a way looking at that prefix from a group side of it, and then generating a report, either assigning it a specific policy or, expiring if it hasn't been used. But again, you'd want to test that out. So.
Yeah, and if you want to get like back to basics, if you don't want to get too crazy, you could just have a PowerShell that queries your groups, and what expiration is looking for is any sort of activity. So your PowerShell could just add and delete a file that still counts as activity to the SharePoint site collection, or basically anywhere in Teams. So even if you just posted and deleted a message, that's going to count as being active. So that's kind of if I think about a way around it, just any sort of read and write or delete is gonna cover that for you too.
Perfect. And I know that there's a lot of third-party applications out there as well that can generate a lot of those reports. I believe ShareGate's Apricot, and then there's AvePoint's got a product out there from a governance perspective as well that we're starting to come across, obviously from a management perspective. So if you're someone that grew up in the SharePoint space, you're well aware of SharePoint sites that are no longer used and having to plan for that and how that comes across. If you're someone that's more or less from the Exchange side of the world or the Skype for Business side, probably a little bit new from you, but certainly, if there's things that aren't used, it's always a good opportunity to clean things up. So recommending, obviously, either an automatic process like what we talked through, or potentially even setting it up from a quarterly review, where it's just, you set some time aside quarterly. Monthly might be a little bit too much, maybe not at the beginning, but once you get in there, in terms of whether groups or teams are used and if they're still needed. It also is a good opportunity for you when you take a look at that. If you really own that from an IT perspective, it's really important for you to maybe review, okay, here, this is a department or team that is using it heavily. What are they doing? And then maybe there's another group or team internally that's not using it, and they're up for expiration. How can I help them or coach them through utilizing Teams more? What behaviors do we need to look at and change? And so that's certainly something to keep in mind as well. Again, a lot of this has to deal with how much you let users create from the beginning. If you limit how much users can create from the beginning, you probably won't have as much from an expiration perspective. I'm going to jump through this here a little bit quicker, since we talked already about blocked words, as well as other items in here. So certainly when you take a look at that from a blocked words perspective, it's not looking at the substring, it's specifically looking at the word itself. All right. We talked through that already. There's some PowerShell in there as well. We did that. The next item here to think about when you're looking at the idea of restricting group creation is utilizing a security group on who can create Microsoft 365 groups. This is going to impact more than just one area. So certainly when you take a look at this, this is heavily documented from Microsoft. In fact, whenever I need to run it, I typically just look at the script from Microsoft. I have my own version out there, but certainly they have it documented on the doc site. So when you take a look at this, this is where you can actually set your specific tenant to only allow a certain group of people to be able to create groups, whether they're teams or modern team sites within inside of SharePoint, or planners as well. So keep that in mind, that's a important item. If you do want to restrict that, that's essentially turning off the power to the house, right? Or turning off the water. So it's going to really stop the flood of new teams or new groups being created, and allow you to set up some policies around there. Again, there's a balance there that if you make it too restrictive, then users are going to find another way to do it. So you obviously always have to find that balance portion. The other item to make mention about is when you think about the group usage guidelines, there is an option here as well to populate that. Yeah, thanks, Jason. I use it and don't recommend anyone without it. Chris and I had a client with a little over 1,200 users that came from a Slack shop, and they had roughly 2,600 Slack channels that moved into, we built a custom application to move them all into Microsoft Teams with all the information behind the scenes as well. And that was one of the pieces that we wanted to restrict, and they said it would be too much because it would impact how they used to use Slack. And so they chose not to. But Jason, always questioning that decision in that case. So I echo that 100%. With that, when we take a look at usage guidelines, this is an option here on when we take a look at groups, what they can and cannot do with groups. So allowing you to have that guidelines available when someone goes to create a group. Now, with that here as well, if you do have some internal or guest guidelines that are there, keep in mind you can utilize that. The URL for internal, of course, could be a SharePoint page, and then the URL for guests, it does need to be externally accessible for users. That is done by PowerShell only, and so certainly there's some steps in to make that happen. I will upload this slide deck at the end as well and share out, so that way if you are someone that wants to look at that, you can. We already talked about the expiration component as well, so certainly keep that in mind, that active groups are automatically renewed. To what Chris said earlier, active activity means anyone using something, right? So with that, that is a file uploaded, that is a chat message or a channel message rather with inside of there. The file is probably the least, the least difficult thing to accomplish. All right, we did that already. Chris, Teams templates.
Alrighty, so Teams templates are really great. I actually, working in healthcare kind of was actually what drove me to start researching templates and getting into using templates. A lot of times in healthcare, we would actually go through and Actually turn my camera on so you guys can see my beautiful face this early in the morning. There we go. So working back in healthcare actually kind of drove my adoption to using Teams templates, because a lot of times they were finding that there were different initiatives that they wanted to do. And when you work for a big hospital system, trying to go through and do Teams adoption is really hard, because a lot of times people look at the productivity of when you start using Teams. And if you think of someone's average day-to-day life, if we're here, we start going through and we see a dip in production and productivity as people start to learn the technology, and then we see it start to spike up as people get more comfortable with that technology and move forward. So one of the ways that we got around, people being, oh, I don't want to use Teams, it's a lot of work and stuff, was to use Teams templates. And so you can do some pretty cool stuff with Teams templates. You can use existing teams as a template for creating a team. Now that's available when you're using the add or create a team button within Microsoft Teams. The other option is to actually create templates within the admin center, which is a really great option as you start to look of ways to drive adoption. Especially my whole thing, and everybody that ever works with me will say, I'm all about process automation and how can we increase efficiencies in people's day-to-day lives. I know we're all busy, so Teams templates is a really great way for you to say, hey guys, you're the project management team. What does your average team look like? And how can we go forward and say, hey, you know what, you want to use Teams and we want to make your life easy for you, we're going to go ahead and we're going to show you that, hey, let's sit down for 20 minutes, talk about all of the different features that you could want within your Teams team. And we're going to make that template accessible to you so that you can go through, and when you're ready to spin up a team, we already have everything built out for you. So Teams templates is a really great way to do that. Excuse me. Pat, if we can, thank you. So there's a few different ways that you could do templates. You can make templates in the 365 Admin Center by going into the Teams Admin Center, but you can also use the PNP PowerShell template. Excuse me. And so if you're going to do a lot of Teams templates, I recommend using the PNP PowerShell, because you can just pound them all out. But if you've only got a few to do, the 365 Admin Center is a really great place to go. One thing to mention is, as you guys are rolling out Teams, really make sure that you go into that Teams template center and you remove all of the non-pertinent Teams templates from your users' visibility in the global, global org-wide defaults. If we go into there and go to template policies. There we go. And then the global org-wide default. Remember, guys, when we're looking at creating policies and doing our policies for the organization, global org-wide default should be your most restrictive policy. That's assigned to all of your users by default. So what I always recommend doing is, if you're a healthcare company, there's absolutely no reason for organizing a help desk to be within your organization and have that available for your end users. So what I always recommend doing is selecting them all and unselecting the ones that you want to show your users. So let's say project management, demo, RSM healthcare, and Boardsite. Those are great. If we scroll down a little bit, there should be one for actually hospitals. So if we do hospital and patient care, those are two great ones. That we actually used to use a lot, and I would customize these. And now that I've done that, I can go ahead and click hide. Now what'll happen is, if we're a healthcare organization, I can publish this to all of my users and say, hey, these are the templates that we think that are going to be necessary for you. The awesome thing about this being a policy is that we can assign these different policies to different user groups. So maybe my IT team has access to different policies than our project management team, which is going to has different policies than our, the charge nurses that are going to be on the hospital floor doing all of the actual patient care and really driving adoption on the floor. So Teams templates are a great way to go through, but I really recommend that if you're rolling this out, please, please, please make sure that you go in and remove the templates that aren't going to be necessary for you. Because if you're an end user and you look and you're like, well, we're a hospital, why do we have stuff for banking? Like, clearly our IT team isn't really thinking about this whole broader rollout. The next thing you could go is into team templates. And 1 second, guys, my allergies are acting up today. Sorry about that. This is the place where you can go to manually create team templates. So if we go, we look here, here's some templates that have been created, but it's just as simple to go ahead and click add. A great feature is if you already have something similar on that last page, sorry, Pat, on that last page, you also have the option to duplicate a team template that you already have created. So if I say, hey, I really like this project management template, but you know what, I want to tweak it a little bit because there's a different, maybe we have enterprise projects versus having small, medium business projects, and they have a little bit of a different outlook, go through and make those changes. And exactly, yeah, Brian, IT should not be deciding what these templates look like. This is the time for you to really lean into your end users and hear what they have to say. Let them play with Teams for a little bit. What I always say is like, show them the basic policies that or the basic templates that Microsoft has thrown out there. And then you can go through and say, hey, here's what they have available for you. Here's all of the different features of Teams, and here's how you add in different apps to your Teams team. After using this for a few weeks, what do you think is going to be the best team template for you? And we can customize this, lean into the to the end users and make them feel comfortable, and also like they're helping drive adoption. So the more end user input that you get, the more people are going to be like, oh, hey, this is less of like a top down, we're diving into things, and more of a, hey, we have the opportunity to actually make an impact on the organization. And so this is a really great way is to just go through and make a copy of that. And then go here, you can make those minor modifications. Maybe we decide, you know what, we need to kick off channel, but we also, yes, we need to delete that because we would never want to show that to end users. But we need to also go in and maybe we need to have a project deliverables channel. We can go through and with a really easy, just click of a button, we can go through and create deliverables. And maybe in that deliverables folder, we want to have a list automatically created. Planner is going to be a great option for that. But sometimes you decide, hey, you know what? List is going to offer me more functionality by going into that channel. I can then go in and customize by clicking edit when we're at the top there and going in and adding lists. All right, cool beans. So that's pretty much a basic overview of how to do that within the admin center. Like I said, this is the screen. So when you're going in, you get this option when you click join or create a team in Teams. You could do from scratch or from a template, and the templates just show up in a list. And this is actually we talk about right there is going through who should be doing this. Is it going to be an end user IT? Like I said, you guys really want to work together and create that synergy so that everybody feels involved. I'm going to take a quick stop and read the comments.
No, I agree with what you said, Chris and Michelle. It does belong to that stakeholder governance group on how that's used for it. So whether or not it's a group of people, or maybe depending upon the size of the organization, you may have to try and pull some of that out. But one of the other options there is, if your users are using Teams already, look at the groups that are using them well, and borrow some of the templates that they're using or the structure that they're using as well. But it's a really good way to do all that.
All right, so now we're going to drive into the Request a Team app. Excuse me. The Request a Team app is probably one of my favorite things that Microsoft has put out in a while as part of their open source community code options. I don't know if you guys have actually seen, but on the Microsoft website, and I'll drop the link in the chat in a few minutes, you can actually see Microsoft has partnered with a bunch of different open source community developers to create PowerApps and different integrations into Teams that are already built and ready for you to deploy. I will just preface this by saying, take the directions with a grain of salt and read through the directions completely multiple times before you actually go to deploy the app, and critically think about what some of the directions say. You will actually notice that there are a few steps missing as you go to deploy this. They're trying their best with the directions, but I've had a few times, I think every time I go to deploy one of these apps that's in the community code repo, something's just not right, or it doesn't work as well as I would hope that it would. But the Request a Team app is a really great option for you. If you want to lock down 365 group creation and you want to go through and, excuse me, have these options for your users to go in and decide, hey, I do want to request a team. Pat, if you could go forward one slide for me. We have a couple different options when we create teams. We can do it the traditional way, and this is not like a Gartner chart or anything like that. This was just me sitting down and really critically thinking about everything from my experience working in teams. And I've done all of these different integrations, and I thought, hey, how much time did I spend actually doing this? What was the return on investment for the organization that I was deploying this option to? And it just depends on where your organization fits. I really like the ServiceNow integration. It's great. It got 10 points out of 14. I think after I've deployed it a few more times and I start to see an organization using ServiceNow really ingrained into their IT development, then it probably could be pretty close to having a 13 or 14 score. But for some of the organizations that I was working with, they weren't fully deployed using ServiceNow. But you have these different options. So I thought about, hey, what is he just like leaving it open and having that, join or create a team option and just leaving that? Well, I think, okay, that's really great. It's got a really high user convenience score because it's exactly how Microsoft designed it to work. And who doesn't love that? But then we think about the administrative convenience. It's abysmal at best if we think about it. This is where you really have to go through, and administrative convenience and tenant management are really I thought about administrative convenience. How much is an IT administrator going to spend trying to fix all of these different teams that are being deployed or do cleanup? Or if you think Pat Pat said it best earlier, if you give everybody access, the ability to create a team, if we think about it, we're going to have 4 HR teams at the end of the day. Now IT, from an administrative convenience perspective, has to go and use a tool like ShareGate or something to start condensing all of these teams together and trying to pick out the pertinent information and create one team and find who all these different members are and whatnot. That's just not, in my opinion, a great option. So,
well, and not to mention, Chris, the amount of teams that would have the word tests in them because a user doesn't quite know what they're creating, and then they just rename it, but on the back end it's still test, right? So
exactly, and that's why when we create our banned words list for M365 groups, we put test in there because we never want a user creating a team with test. If you guys, Brian made a really great point in the comments section about ShareGate. I have to agree, it's pretty awesome. Then I think about tenant management. How, from a life cycle perspective, is this going to be? And Pat called it up as too. If you think about it, we're going to have a million teams with the backend name of test and then some sort of good. Remember, guys, with teams, you have the option that you can have multiple teams with the same name. Whoever gets it first is going to get that as their email address. After that, Microsoft handles the collisions of different team names by appending a GUID or part of the GUID to the team email address, and the name can stay the same. So on the back end, it would actually say like test and then something, but the team name would be something completely different. So we have to think about that. And then out of the box, it's got a 4 because it's just free. Microsoft has it there for you. Help desk. This scored the lowest. My absolute least favorite option is when a company deploys teams and locks down 365 group creation, but doesn't have like some sort of automated process. If you think about the day-to-day, if you're a large organization or even a medium organization, you think if you're really driving teams adoption, you've got people creating multiple teams a day because maybe you've got your company cookout. I know we haven't had those in a while with COVID, but as we start to ramp back up, these are things that you have to think about in different ways that you could drive adoption. Maybe you have an office party, the company cookout, new projects being started. Your IT desk is going to be inundated. And I actually saw this at one of the companies that I was working with where they rolled out teams, locked down 365 group creation. They had a really great adoption where everybody wanted to use Teams, but their help desk was probably spending a few hours a day creating teams because they would have 10 to 15 teams being requested a day and they were still new to the process. Why should we have this duplication of effort when you've already collected all of this information from your users? Because in the ticket, people would be saying, hey, I want these people in the team, I want this being the name, and all of these different features. Also, the person may not know, then your IT staff has to go in, does this team already exist? Is the business case valid for this? And so we think like, hey, this maybe isn't the best option, in my opinion. ServiceNow, like I said, user convenience, I give it a 1. It probably really should be a 2 if we think about it, because we can roll with a custom app creation. We could roll ServiceNow into Teams and kind of surface that through an application. So it's not as bad. But if you think about it, ServiceNow is expensive. If you're not already rolling it out or don't have it in your organization, just to use it for Teams automation would be a terrible idea. Maybe part of a greater, broader IT plan. Yeah, ServiceNow is a good option. There's a bunch of good options now there. ServiceNow is just a prevalent one that Pat and I were seeing across a pretty large cross section of our clients, actually. And then also with some other really big clients that we were working on, they were rolling out ServiceNow and asked about the integration as well. It's great because it's built into the ticketing system. You can use the form, and then there's a lot of automation that goes behind it. We make some REST API calls. It is actually a little bit expensive because we use Power Automate to do the integration. And with that, you have to have the premium connectors because we're making a bunch of REST API calls between Microsoft and ServiceNow to gather all that information. But it is pretty cool. If anybody wants to know more about that, please reach out in the chat or email Pat or myself, and we're more than happy to talk about that. It's actually a pretty cool integration if you already have ServiceNow rolled out. And I wouldn't recommend going the request a team route. But if you don't have ServiceNow, 100%, request a Teams app is going to make your life super easy. And then we have the final option, which got a 14 out of 16. I really can't complain too much about this. Again, I'm probably a little biased, I will admit, in my scoring of this, but it is a great thing because for user convenience, like I said, we can roll this out and put it as a app in the left app rail, which is pretty cool. It doesn't require a lot of maintenance and ongoing support. Administrative convenience, it makes your life easy because you guys can go through and say, hey, this is a great option. But also, you can do the thing that I love the most, which is a not my problem kind of thing. And when you go through, you pick some power users within your organization and you make them responsible for accepting Teams requests. And so you completely take the burden out of you and you say, you guys handle this and you guys decide if this is a good business case to have this team created or does it already exist. So super great option, gives you that full control of all of the teams that are being created. And actually the nice thing is that it runs off of a SharePoint list. So as you guys go through, you have a full list right in SharePoint of all of the teams that were created, who created the team, what the business request was. So as you go and do some of your auditing later on, you have all of the information from your teams. And you have all that right in front of you so you can run some reports. If you're like, hey, why did we create this team? Or if you see a team and you're like, I don't remember that, and it turns out that the user went in and renamed their team, then you're like, oh, hey, this is not what you originally asked for. We're going to take it away from you, or please update your records. So it's a great option, and it's a pretty low cost implementation. Pat, if you could drive next. Awesome. So if we think about how does this solution actually work, well, we'll start at the top and we'll kind of move our way clockwise around back to the top. I love that this is actually a full circle application. It kind of makes me a little excited because I don't often get to do a full circle life cycle of a software. So if we think about it, a user creates a team within a Power App that's published to Teams. The great thing is, yeah, we can publish this Power App as an app in the left-hand app rail to Teams, but we don't have to. The cool thing is you can actually load this into a SharePoint site. So if you have an IT SharePoint site, we can go and we can load this Power App right into your SharePoint site as well. So it's surfaceable in multiple locations. Then once they create that team, as they're going through the process, we're actually using the Graph API and Logic Apps and some SharePoint lists. So when they're going through and they're creating that Teams team, what we'll actually see, and I'll show you guys a full demo in a second, is that they're going through and when they're creating the team, we actually make a few REST API calls to the Microsoft backend to say, hey, does this team already exist? Like, what is this user doing? So we go through, we check a SharePoint list, which is why the nice thing is we do write down all of the teams that were created into a SharePoint list. We make an API call to SharePoint to say, hey, does this match any of these? No? Okay, great. Then we go through, we write this record to a list once they've filled out all of the pertinent information. Once that happens, we go through and then that goes through and says via PowerApps and Teams, an administrator, like I said, you can make this a not your problem kind of thing. It doesn't have to be an IT administrator. It's just whoever you give access to. And the cool thing is it's not like access, like you have to go in and adjust some permissions. All you have to do is just make them an owner of the Teams team that all of these requests are linked to, and then it's a not your problem kind of thing. Then they go through and the administrator or whomever says, hey, yep, this is cool. I'm okay with these people creating this team. Once they click approve, Once they click approve, what we do is we use another Azure Logic app to go through and create the team, add the members, and then we post a little welcome message saying, hey, welcome to Teams. And this message is fully customizable. So you can say, hey, welcome to Teams. Here's all of our company policies on how you use Teams, or here's a link to some basic Teams training. Maybe you want to check this out before you get going. And so I really like that. And then that goes back full circle into Teams, because a user can always check the status of their team when they go into the Teams portal as well. So I do want to talk for a quick second about cost, because I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised at just how cheap this option is. So if we think about all of the different requirements for this, all you need is a service account. Now you could go as low as an F3. It just has to have access to SharePoint. And then have Power Automate assigned to it as well. So not too bad. We look at PowerApps. Well, the great thing is this is a Canvas app. Canvas apps are included with the SharePoint data connectors in your M365 licensing plan. So I think all of the plans from Microsoft now actually have PowerApps, Canvas apps built in for free, which is a great option. The Logic apps, unless you're running like a 300,000 person organization plus, this thing is going to basically be free. If we look at the Logic app basic tier, it's pretty much free. You just have to have an Azure subscription for it to tie against. I've never actually been billed for my Logic app usage. It's usually just a few runs a month, which is less than the minimum billing requirement, because per run it's like 1/10 of a cent. So it's and then I think you get like 500 runs for free. The standalone, I was thinking, it probably took like 5 to 10 hours to stand up for me. We have like a greater solution called Launch Control that we're working on that includes some additional like training and some other cool stuff. So like if we were doing our full solution, Pat and I figured like 20 to 30 hours, but 5 to 10 hours realistically, or less, depending on what you guys are rolling out. So it really doesn't take too much of your time if you think about like labor costing and doing this yourself. Like I said, definitely think more than 10 hours if it's your first time and you're reading through the documentation, read through it again, and then deploy it in a test environment, because I promise you there's going to be something you didn't expect to happen. The PowerShell can be really angry sometimes. And then we think about everything together. When I was like doing the calculations, and it's kind of hard, Microsoft doesn't make it super easy, but for 500 runs a month, which is actually a really decent amount, it was like $5.50 all in. You really can't beat that. If you think about the labor time, like you spend like in 1 month of rolling this out, you've already beat your labor costs for one person creating a team. If you're paying somebody, 75 grand a year, and you take, an hour of their time, every week to create teams, you're well ahead by rolling this out. So I actually, Pat, if you don't mind, can I drive for a second and go through and kind of show these guys around?
Absolutely, go for it. I'll stop sharing.
Alrighty, so this is my Request a Team app, and I know we made the joke about the demo gods earlier. Everybody, please look at the demo gods and say, please let this demo work. I tested it earlier, but like I said, it doesn't always get along with me. So here's our Request a Team app. The cool thing is it's a Canvas app, and you can fully customize all of this. As we go through, this is actually, so by default, out of the box, all you get is these two, the from scratch and build a template. But I, of course, like to make things really extra. And so I threw in our company logo and stuff when we were doing a demo for internal IT. The great thing, you can add extra buttons in. So I threw in here this, like, what is Microsoft Teams? And this is a great video from Microsoft that talks about what Teams is. And then I just threw a link in here for Teams training, because as I have people go through creating teams, I want them to have like a central location to be like, oh, hey, how do I actually learn what Teams is? So we go through, and I just dropped a training link in there to make people's lives easy. Now we have two options on this main splash page. We have the from scratch and the user template. The other thing that we have here is the my requests, approve requests, and request a team. Now, do you remember how I said you could make this a not your thing kind of problem? This all runs off of a M365 group. So whoever is a owner of that M365 group, this button appears. All of your standard users who aren't part of the group as an administrator, they're only going to see my requests, which when we click on it, this is going to show all of the requests that you have. And then we look at request a team. That's the main splash page. Now, administrators, you guys are going to have this approve a request button. This approve a request button. This goes through and shows you, hey, here's all of the teams that have been requested to be created right now. And so we see I had put the request in for this one, reason collaboration, privacy settings private. Now, if I click view details, here's where the pudding is, where you can really see, hey, here's the name, the description that we're going to put in. What's the business reason? This is a great option when you guys are deciding, hey, why should somebody have a team created? And then we have owners. Who are the owners of the team? The cool thing with this team's request app is that it requires 2 owners be added to a team. If we think about it, we don't have orphan teams anymore, guys. If somebody leaves your organization, you don't just have 1 owner. How great is that? And then we can put in all of the different members that we want as part of this team. Whether we have confidential data, this is a hidden option, but what you guys can do is through some settings within the SharePoint side that controls all of this, we can actually control what is visible to the user. So this is a hidden option. And we can actually use this to drive some of those, if we talk about earlier, where we were doing sensitivity labels, we can actually use this with some minor modifications to the code to drive sensitivity label adoption. And like I said, you could modify the PowerShell and the logic app that goes behind this to add different things. If you want to add stuff to the property bag of the SharePoint list, you could kick off an Azure runbook as well. The visibility, so we know it's going to be a private team, and we're not using any special templates, so it's just going to be a standard team. I go ahead and click approve. If you want to, you can add a comment. This is a comment that the requester can then go back and see when they go into their stuff. It's more, I would like to say, if you're denying a team, put a comment in there so people could say, hey, my team was denied, why? And they can look at the comments. Approval, like I said, if you're approving it, it doesn't really require a comment. But if you want to, you can put a comment in there. One cool thing is if we go through and we look at, I'll show you the back end of this in a second. We keep track of a lot of other metadata, so you guys don't have to put it in the comment section like this was approved by so-and-so. We actually already know that because we track that data. How cool is that? So if I go in and just drop this pop out for a second, I'm just going to walk through this process from scratch. If I do it from scratch, the first thing we want to ask the user is, hey, what do you want the visibility to be? Do we want this to be a public team or a private team? Now, if I select private, we give them a little tooltip and it says, hey, just so you know, people are going to need permission to join this. If we do it public, it just says, hey, just so you know, anyone in your organization can join this team. What I want to do for another revision of this app is actually make this bold and really in the user space when they click public to let them know, just so you know, everyone, and we mean everyone, can see this team. The next thing I want to do after this is we're going to go through and we're going to say, hey, give your team a name. Now check this out. So if I go in for a second, and I'm just going to discard this request for a second. I actually want to grab this name. So I go through and I am Karen from finance and I decide, hey, I want to have a team created. I just got hired here and I think we should use it for our team's team. Well, we go through and I put that in there and I say, hey, check availability. Here's the cool part, guys. When we go check availability, this is that API call that we make to SharePoint that says, hey, does this already exist? And we check that list. It says, just so you know, this is already taken. So then that in the user's head should say, hey, you know what? Maybe this is already existing. I should probably reach out to someone and say, hey, does this already exist? And so I'm
Chris,
just going to put.
Could we also put, potentially, with that, could you surface that URL to that team or URL
Totally.
or the owner of that team so that way they could reach out as well?
Yep, I would just have to modify the Graph API call and grab the additional. So if we think it just reads the row of that SharePoint list, so we would just have to grab the other column, which is going to be the owner, and then we could totally pipe that back in the response and just say, hey, this is the owner, and grab those 2 variables and put it in there. We also we do load in the team's link. So what is the link to that team site? So we could also just present that to the end user. So there's a lot of data. I'll actually show you guys the SharePoint list that runs this whole thing. Once you create it, you actually really don't have to go into PowerApps to modify it. A lot of it can be done through a SharePoint list, which is really nice. So I go in and I say, hey, you know what? Fine, I'm going to do something else. This is great. I put in my description, which is going to be, you know, I was not blessed with the ability to speak and type at the same time, guys. Sorry. I envy all of those people. So now that we've had all this info, we can actually go through. If I go through and I just delete this for a second, if I click next, it's going to be like, no. So all of these boxes have to be filled out, which is pretty cool. In a different version of this app, I've actually have this button be inactive until everything's filled out, which is kind of convenient. So I actually would recommend doing that too. Just change the way that the button, it's just a property within the button, and you basically just have to say, make sure all these boxes, if all these boxes have content, then turn on. So now that we go through that, we've got all the team information. Now we want to add those two owners. So I'm going to go ahead and add myself and then Pat. And this is actually, interestingly enough, a combo box, but it does not use the search AD. Just so you guys know, the AD search option within PowerApps can only surface the first 500 users. That is really not useful for a lot of organizations, because between guest service accounts and all of your users, there is a high probability you have far more than 500 users in your Active Directory. So there's a bit of a workaround. I definitely download the app and play around and see what Microsoft did. But just so you guys know, this isn't actually using the search AD option within 365. And then I'm going to make Pat the other owner. Alrighty, and the members, I'm going to add my coworker Scott and my other coworker Jeff. Okay. We go through next. And I don't know if you guys actually noticed a cool feature. If we actually go through here, it can actually surface guest accounts too. How cool is that? So one of the other options that I did for this page for a aerospace company was we built in a guest user request part of this as well. So they could go in and they had to do training and some background checks before a user could be added to the tenant as a guest. So that was another part of one of these apps that we deployed, was a whole guest provisioning process that sent the guest an email, told them instructions on how to join. And then once they sent back the different training requirements, that was approved by a human, filed away in the different locations that need to be for compliance. The user account was created, and then you can now surface guest accounts, which is pretty neat stuff in my opinion too. Not just all your local AD accounts or just internal users. It gives me one last option to say, hey, here's all the things that you've put in. Does this all look correct? And I say, yes, it does. And then it says, hey, your request has been submitted. Did you know that you can go check the status of your team's request right here? And so if we take a look right now, it says submitted. It'll only say submitted for about 45 seconds. Right now in the background, we actually have a bunch of different processes running. So there's both a Power Automate and a Logic app right now that are both cooking away in the background. They take about 5 minutes to run, just so you guys know, in each time. So right now, the first one ran. That first one takes about 45 seconds to a minute to run in the background, and that's the one that goes through and says, hey, we have a new request being created. Somebody has to go approve it. So now if I look at the approved requests, if I give it a minute, you'll notice that nothing shows up here. Right now, I actually do probably have like 2 or 3 flows running in the background that are going through and saying, hey, somebody please go do something with this. And of course, as the demo gods would have it, my Power Automate failed. So like I said, of course, that would happen to me. But go through, so something's happening, but we did see, so part of it did run, but the other Power App didn't run right now, guys. Sorry about that. But we can go through and see, hey, it did show up here in the approved request. Right now it says pending approval. So if I go back into my request and refresh, you see now how it says pending approval. So that updates the user saying, hey, somebody's going to take a look at it. So they can actually go through. The cool thing is, if a user has already created a team before, they can go through and clone their request instead of, if I need the same thing but with a different name, I can go through and clone the request, which is a great option from my request page. This will show you all of your requests that you've done. But again, here's the approve request option, and let's actually see if the team was created. Hey, so it did work. Just some of it's not working. You guys can't see the back end. But so we do see here, remember how I approved that Teams team for the original one that I created before we started? You can see here, it created the team. If I go in here, it will have added the members. So I can see that Pat, myself, and this service account are added as owners. I know that my flow didn't run properly because the request a team service account is still an owner of the team. What it actually does is at the end of the logic app, it goes through and it removes itself as an owner, which is a great thing. So people don't actually know that it was created by a service account. And then I see I've got Scott and Jeff. I basically made the same request before we all started so you guys could see it kind of live full circle. So it did create that already, which is super awesome. And then here is that message that we created and just said, hey, this was created by the app. For organizations, I usually like to work with the IT team or some internal communications team to say, hey, let's find like a positive message to put in here or some pertinent information for your users. So how does all of this cool stuff run? So it actually runs off of a Power App, 2 flows, and 2 logic apps. So if we go in through here, this is the service account that runs this whole environment. We have 2 flows. So we have the check team availability. This is part of the Power App, which goes through, and this basically kicks off a Graph API call. If we look through here and we just take a quick edit at it. Basically, based on the Power App, we go through, we grab some information, we check if the site exists via a SharePoint API call, and this is just going through and reading that SharePoint list. And then we're going to send it back to the Power App. But how it actually happens on the back end is that goes through and actually works with this in tandem with this logic app. And this logic app goes through and checks your SharePoint list, goes through and does some other stuff too. This can all be modified as well. I have made some modifications to it if I do want to write to the SharePoint property bag, or if I want to kick off a PowerShell script as well. The other one that really where they say the devil's in the details is going to be this one. This process of Teams requests is actually what makes all the magic happen. We had created this before PowerApps could create before Power Automate could create teams. So this goes through and does actually a lot as we go through. It does double check one more time to make sure that the site doesn't already exist. We use our service account to do a lot of this stuff. As you saw, the service account is added to the team because back in the day when this was originally created, we had to have a service account as part of the team. We check our naming convention settings. So if we do, again, this can check naming conventions too. So if you guys go through and you say, hey, I do want to do naming conventions, this is totally acceptable and a great option for you guys to use because it is aware of naming conventions. We just have to make sure we put our naming conventions in the SharePoint list. And I'll just quickly scroll through it. You guys can read what it does. Any questions so far on what I've talked about? I know I've been doing a lot of talking. I do want to take a second as I finish scrolling through this to give you guys an opportunity to say, hey, I have a question.
The only thing that's going on in the chat, Chris, is that Brian and Tim are sacrificing Chromebooks and flash drives for you right now for the demo gods. So
thanks, guys. I appreciate it. I think the Chromebook did the trick because it actually did work, as much as I needed it to. If anybody happens to have a floppy disk that they could crack in half for me, that might finish this demo off with full success.
You want to go to the SharePoint site as well?
Yep,
just
absolutely.
To show what that list looks like. Jason has a good question in there. Is it good to find a partner to help with the Request a Teams app if you've never deployed one before? It's good to find a good mentor or a good helper if you've never done this type of deployment before. So I did post the list of all the app templates out there. Some of them are very easy to use, and some of them become a little bit more complicated, like this one does. But again, when you take a look at it from a level of effort, perspective, 5 to 10 hours can get an app up and running. And then once you go through it, Chris and I have the same mentality. Once you go through it, it's a teach to fish kind of opportunity. So ensuring that then in the future you can, deploy it. There's a lot of good apps out there in that listing of Teams apps, and there's videos on this specific app as well. But again, it's that one direction that you miss along the way.
Yeah, I I remember the first time I deployed this app. It was probably 2 years ago, and the directions were a lot worse than they are now. And I think I had to try like 5 or 6 times. And the worst part, there wasn't like a cleanup. So it would create like half of the resources for this, and then I would fail on its provisioning. And you had to go through and find like 15 different items to delete, and then delete those from the recycle bin. It really became quite abysmal. So yeah, I highly recommend. And it actually still kind of does that, but I've figured out how to make the PowerShell script bend to my whim a little better than I used to, which is nice. But this goes through, if we actually look, this is the Teams request settings. Remember how I said that once the app is deployed, you actually really don't have to do a lot. It kind of just works, which is great. And then those minor setting changes that you have to make, they're actually done through the SharePoint list, which is super cool. So we can do the classifications where I talked about before, whether it's confidential data or not, or your different classifications that you have for your sensitivity labels. Like we can make all of that tie together and display that to the end users via different combo boxes, which is nice. You can control your managed path. So if we think about it, we have we have the your tenant.com/SharePoint, and then we've got the /teams or /sites. You can control where this stuff saves, which is nice. This is just used for the backend provisioning. It's just one of the variables that we pull. This is the team ID that controls who has access to the administrator settings or the approve requests. So that's where this pulls from. And then this channel it can actually post into a Teams team with the Power Automate to say, hey, somebody submitted a request. Here's those block words list. Test. Should always be one that you add in here so that users aren't creating a team name with test. Drive me up a wall and save you guys some time at the same time. Naming conventions, you can go through and you can tell it, yes, I do want to use naming conventions, and then I can put my naming conventions in this box. Here is the Teams requests. So remember when I said we have a list of all of the requests that have gone through. This is where it is. If we take a quick look at some of the metadata that we're pulling and saving for ourselves, we have, the team name, what's the display name going to be, the description, the business justification, the owners, the members, the visibility. Then we have the status, where it stands within. So we have pending approval, team created, it was never submitted. We have whether it's confidential, the template ID, so it was just a standard team, what stage it is. Here's that comments section that I talked about. So any comments that are put in here, you'll be able to surface those. And then classification, this goes through and talks about any classifications that you have. We do have, so if we do want to grab this in our API call, we could actually grab the team URL. So if somebody looks for the same, looks for a team, like we said before, if Karen from finance goes to stand up a team and finds out that it already exists, we can grab this URL and we can pump this back in as a button and say, hey, click here to see the team that already exists, or to request to join the team that already exists. The reason, if it failed, the approval dates, and then the SharePoint site behind it, when it was created, and then we have who it was created by. So this was, who requested it. And then we have our team templates. So if we go through and we talk about all of the different templates that we have, you can go through and you can actually just through here, you kind of, there's the team templates that we have in the SharePoint or the Teams world, and we have templates that are created in here. I am still kind of trying to find a way to make it a little more automated. Right now, if you go in here, you have to like manually fill out what the channels that are going to show up are so that the user can see it. And then we pull it and say, hey, here's the template ID on Microsoft that's in our tenant. There really isn't a good way that if you create the template in the Teams admin center that it automatically pumps into here. I'm hoping, as they make more API calls, that we can just use an API call to say, here's all the templates that are available for you, and make it a little more efficient. But it is, I will say, there's just a little bit of duplication of effort. And that's pretty much the Teams request a team app in a nutshell. Does anybody have any questions? Stunning. I love it. All right, Pat, if you want to.
There was one question from Jason. Any tips on the best practice for renaming a team when a team owner requests that?
So post a team being deployed through the request a team app, like you have to go into the team and rename it. What you can do is you could just update the SharePoint list. So if I decide, hey, you know what, maybe we actually need to change the name. If you're going to update the team in M365, I would go into the list and update the title as well.
When you take a look at renaming a team, though, itself, obviously, I think some of the point there to Jason's is if I just go and rename a team, it doesn't rename the SharePoint site, doesn't rename the email address. So those types of best practice would be not to rename, but obviously you're limited there when it comes to it, chasing it down. I haven't seen it, but I did see an announcement that when you rename a channel, the folders in SharePoint document library are now supposed to be renamed at some point to be the same. So you'll no longer have that disconnect with channel names, but they haven't quite done that rename master and make it be flow throughout.
Yeah, there's still these small little nuances from an admin perspective that Microsoft is working through.
All right, we have about 10 minutes left for it, and I know we've had quite a bit of participation here. So Tim, if you want to start looking at the participation piece of it, I just have about 5 more minutes of content here to run through, and then we'll get you guys on your way. So just get the deck up here. And a round of applause for Chris for going through that and being brave enough to do a live demo with everyone, I think is the key. All right, so Teams policies, we've echoed this quite a bit, and you've heard us mention it throughout the entire presentation. Policies can be enabled, obviously, on a lot of different items, whether they're Teams or meetings or live events, the messaging, the app permission, or the app setup on that left-hand rail that's out there. When we take a look at policies, you can assign them multiple different ways, right? So when you take a look at creating policies, think about that global org-wide default as the most restrictive. And then maybe there's an IT policy. Maybe there's a country policy or a role policy. We see that role policy a lot when it comes to financial institutions, when they want to look at what can a teller do versus a operations or a mortgage specialist. We also see that a little bit when it comes to the different types of licensing or, what level of access users have. In this case of it as well, you could also, offer flexible where you can have a live event policy, but then the same messaging policy. So, when you think about that aspect of it, it's important to note that policies are really configurable. Documentation is key. In terms of what you're making changes to, especially on that global org-wide default, and review them on a regular basis. Microsoft likes to add new settings in there when things roll out. Newer one that's been included in there now, if you haven't been there recently, has been the video background is now part of a policy, as well as the recording expiration is also part of a policy as well. So if you haven't been in there, review your global org-wide default policies. Again, when we think about it, policies are assigned on an org-wide side of it. You can edit the default policy, and you can also create custom policies as well, to make them either more restrictive or more permissive. I err on the side with what Chris mentioned, where that global org-wide should be the most restrictive. So when I add a new user into my organization, that's what they pick up, and then I open it up as well. Creating policies, you can create them in PowerShell. With that, as well as with inside of the UI, Microsoft actually has some pretty good PowerShell templates out there now for some of those baseline policies. If you look at applying them and creating them, the Admin Center is really an easy way though to consume them. Because keep in mind, policies are something that you need to review and make modifications to, but you don't constantly have to report on them or constantly have to make modifications or adjustments to it. So yes, you could script it out if you're someone like that. But again, if you ask me, and you're in charge of an organization, you could probably use your scripting another method a little bit more effective than creating policies. When we take a look at it from there, meeting policies is one that I think is important just to highlight here. And this is our last section we'll run through. When we think about organizer piece of it, I'm going to jump forward one slide for us. And when we take a look at cloud recording and IP video, to simplify this a little bit, we have Chris, myself, and then a colleague of ours, Hassan. So if cloud recording is allowed, when Pat organizes a meeting, Pat and Hassan can record the meeting, but not Chris, because Chris is not allowed to click that record button. If Chris organizes the meeting, no one can record. If Hassan organizes a meeting, no one can share their video because he has the allow IP video as false. And if Pat organizes the video, only Pat can share the video. That's important because Pat rules. That's why I'm the only one that can do anything. So just something to make mention about. In the deck, there's a lot more information around it. But again, we do want to be respectful, and you've spent almost 90 minutes with us here this morning. So thank you for that. But if anyone's got any questions for it, and I know a lot of people are interested in that $25 gift card as well. So there is a question in there. Looks like from Jason, anonymous users in Teams, do you find it causes a lot of problems when it's disabled? I noticed that audio conferencing, you can force anonymous users to identify themselves when they call in. Is there a way to make it mandatory when anonymous, thanks, that moved it up on my screen. Anonymous users to identify themselves by name when they call in, make it mandatory to join through the Teams desktop or web app, or can you still allow anonymous users to join, but we're required to identify themselves? That's a lot. I want to take a second and read through that again myself without speaking through it, so I can pick it up. Chris, if you followed along with it, feel free to chime in. But great. Tim, if you want to give that away, I'll get Jason's question here answered in just a moment.
All right, good deal. Thank you guys. That was excellent here. Really, actually, I enjoyed quite a bit of the Teams app breakdown. Definitely have clients consistently asking for how do we manage Teams, how do we build a request process, and it's nice to have some options that are canned, ready to go, and that you can deploy and customize as well. So real quick, while Pat's doing that, I'm going to drop the survey link in the chat as well. And then based on the audience participation here, in fact, if you win here, stick around. I may need to get your information, an email. Otherwise, we can actually pull it from registration. So, all right. So we have about 6 people that actually contributed here. I have it in a randomizer, and I'm going to spin my wheel here. You guys can't hear the cool sound effects, but the winner is Matt Klein. So Matt, if I will find you and send you a message if you want to go ahead and give me your email address, and congratulations. Next track, sorry, Pat, I won't take up too much more of your time here, but the next track is going to be Joel Olison. And the administration track, and he's going to talk about planning and deploying Microsoft Viva connections. So there's plenty of good other sessions too, or if you want to stick around for Joel, I'll also post a link to the board. I'm sure you guys have seen it, but if you want to go check out all the sessions we have available. So with that, I'll Pat, if you want to finish up.
Yep, perfect, thank you. So Jason, might be, I'll put some items in there. I'm starting to reply to your message specifically on this in terms of it, but I think some of the questions I would have on there is, what do you want that experience to look like? Obviously, if you have that audio conferencing bridge available and users are dialing in. I'm assuming that's where you're catching some of that component that's there. I'm not aware of a policy that would require a user to have to use the desktop or web app or mobile app to come in, especially if you're allowing the call-in functionality. But I'll post some thoughts at least in there in the chat for you, replying to that message here shortly. But otherwise, with that, I think Viva Connections is up next, and that is, if you haven't seen that before or exposed to that, that is also another one of those relatively easy apps to get set up if you have a solid SharePoint intranet, and it just helps with the adoption of Microsoft Teams. So with that, Chris, any last thoughts here this morning?
I think I'm good. We talked about policies at the end, and I just wanted to call out, when you guys are using the policies, I really recommend using the global, locking down all your global org-wide defaults. But then if you have that group-based policy assignment, highly recommend using those options. And then avoid policy packages like the plague is kind of what I always say. Those came out before group-based policy assignment was really a thing. One thing to call out, just so you guys are aware, you guys can directly assign policies to users. So you have three options. You have the global org-wide default, then you have those group-based policy assignments, and then the direct assignment through the Teams Admin Center or PowerShell. Direct assignment takes precedence. So you have your global org-wide default. If they're part of a policy that's going to be assigned via a group, that's going to take precedence over the global org-wide default. But then finally, if you directly assign a policy to someone, that's going to take the most precedence over everything. And those policy packages directly assign policies to users. So inadvertently, if you roll that out and then you're like, oh, hey, you know what, I want to use these group-based policy assignments, you're going to be writing 99 lines of PowerShell to undo all of that direct policy assignment that you've done. It's the only thing I like to call out. It can be a little faux pas. But no, thank you guys so much for coming. I appreciate it. Really insightful questions that you guys asked. And if you guys ever need help with the request a team app, reach out to Pat or I.
All right. Awesome. Thank you all.
All right. Excellent, guys. Thank you very much. So if you guys are sticking around, the session title again is Plan and Deploy Microsoft Viva Connections, and Joel Olson is with us. I don't know, Joel, are you in the channel yet? Hopefully he gets here. I'm going to stop recording here.